Miles Larson had never thought of himself as anyone important. He began each morning the same way, brewing a cup of coffee in his drafty studio apartment, flipping half-heartedly through the local paper, and then heading out the door to start his postal route. He had grown comfortable with a monotony that felt reassuring, even protective. In the half-light of dawn, the streets remained quiet. The thick, century-old buildings dwarfed him as he made his way to the small postal station at the heart of the city. The hume hunt of traffic hadn't yet risen to its usual rumble, and the sidewalks were occupied only by a few newspaper vendors and stray cats. Miles liked these tranquil hours best, when everything seemed manageable and unthreatening. That morning, Miles stepped into the fluorescent-lit corridor of the postal office to retrieve his card and the stacks of envelopes assigned to him. He followed his usual protocol, sorted by zip code first, then by street, then by building number. Today, there were 2 thick, unusual letters with no return addresses. The typed text on their envelopes was crisp, each addressed in thick black letters to unfamiliar recipients. Something in the style of the addresses struck him as old-fashioned, like a formal invitation to a bygone society event. He tried not to dwell on it, but could not shake a vague sense of unease. Letters without return addresses weren't uncommon, but these lacked the usual postal codes too. With a puzzled frown, he slipped them into his bag. His route was waiting, after all, and timeliness was paramount. His first stops were routine, a series of dingy apartments and corner shops. He handed a bundle of bills and advertisements to a shop owner who was busy hoisting a metal gate open, then climbed concrete steps to distribute letters to the residents of an aging row of brownstone. It wasn't until an hour into his shift, outside a boarded-up storefront on Winston Street, that he paused to examine one of the strange letters again. He'd been about to drop it into a vacant building's mailbox, except the mailbox had disappeared. The entire place was sealed and shuttered, clearly no longer inhabited. He stared at the address on the envelope. It matched the vacant structure perfectly. 24 Winston Street, Atten Y. Laurent, but the building had been abandoned for years. He let out a long breath, suppressed a shiver, and slid the letter back into his bag. Strict rules prohibited opening mail not addressed to oneself, but the letter seemed destined for nowhere. Maybe it would end up in the dead letter bin. However, ignorance nagged at him like an itch he couldn't reach. He tamped down the urge to tear the envelope open, deciding he'd deal with it back at the postal station. By midday, the city was in full hustle. Worn bricks glowed under a high sun, and traffic had swelled to its usual frantic pace. Lunch-hour throngs pushed past one another on sidewalks. Construction crews hammered away at half-finished buildings, sending echoes off the surrounding walls. Miles normally enjoyed the pleasant chaos. Garnering barely a second glance from the passers-by, he returned to the station for a quick break, a treat he rarely permitted himself, but the 2 letters still weighed on his mind. There had been another one that morning, a near twin of the first, a dark green envelope addressed to someone named Lauren Finch, similarly lacking a known address. He'd placed it in the same compartment of his cart as the other. Part of him wanted to fling them into the drawer for lost mail as soon as possible. Another part felt an inexplicable magnetism to those envelopes, as if they carried a secret only he might decode. He ducked into the back office at the station, fiddling with the latch on his metal locker. The small space was empty, quiet except for the echo of distant footsteps. Carefully, Miles took out the pair of envelopes and studied them again, turning them over in his hands. The city's name was spelled out in a stylized script at the tops, but after that the text evolved into archaic phrases, half lost in swirling ornaments. He could almost make out references to a date and time, but they were described in a cryptic manner. When the sky is bruised by the scarlet band, and the clock tolls thrice after midnight. Miles blinked, thinking it might be a promotional gimmick for some local haunted attraction. His curiosity finally won out. He slipped 2 gloved fingers under the unsealed flap of one. The envelope wasn't actually taped shut. He gently extracted a single parchment page. Its surface had an unusual texture, not quite paper, not quite parchment. almost as if it had been crafted by hand centuries ago. Though the text was typed, the style of the letters imitated elegantly looped handwriting. He squinted and began to read. "Beware the coming nights, for they are riven with unnatural storms that swirl out of the east. When the moon wanes past the first quarter, the gates shall open. The beasts will stir beneath our streets. Heed this message, city dwellers, lest you let him in and lose all that binds you to your mortal forms." His heart seemed to skip a beat. This certainly wasn't an advertisement for a haunted hayride or a seasonal show. Each sentence carried a heavy weight, as if penned by prophets rather than pranksters. He felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach, but pressed on. "Gather in places of light, or watch, as shadows claim you. Seek the fortune teller on Marsh Avenue for counsel. Trust no false guardians." More cryptic instructions followed, riddled with references to a looming threat. A shaky laugh escaped Miles' lips. It had to be a hoax, right? But the letter's words clung to him like tendrils of thick fog. He wanted to dismiss them, yet he remembered hearing about a bizarre thunderstorm predicted to roll in from the east. The radio weather report had mentioned possible hail. This might be a coincidence, or cunningly orchestrated. He slid the page back into the envelope, heart hammering. A sense of intrusion creeping over his shoulders. His remaining deliveries for the day felt endless. He tried to focus, but each time he delivered a new piece of mail, he worried it came with some hidden omen. By evening, he pushed his cart back inside the station's garage with relief. Those 2 odd envelopes had consumed his thoughts all afternoon. While his colleagues packed up or chatted about weekend plans, Miles hovered at his station, eyes flashing to the clock. Instead of leaving, he took the second envelope from his bag. If he'd gone this far, he might as well read the other. If it contained similar warnings, then maybe there was truly some orchestrated plan, a twisted attempt to trick people, or maybe it was something else altogether. He read the second letter under the sickly glow of fluorescent lights. This one was longer, containing references to whispers in the city's underground and a secret sign of violet flames flickering in deserted alleys. It warned that when the painted bell in the old church tower rang thrice after midnight, it would herald the arrival of a monstrous power. Another mention of 3 tolls after midnight. The letter concluded with a dire prediction. The city will stand on the cusp of devouring itself if the gates are not sealed. He only needs the frightened hearts of a few to break the final lock. Miles found himself glancing around, almost expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking by the lockers, waiting for him to finish reading. He flexed his fingers nervously. The words felt real, in a way that made his scalp tingle. He thought of dropping them in the trash, telling himself it was nonsense, yet something in the urgency of the text refused to let him sink back into that comforting monotony. That night, after stepping into his apartment, Miles realized he had taken both letters home with him, tucked inside his coat pocket. He set them on his small kitchen table, next to the pile of grocery store receipts and discount flyers he often forgot to throw out. The overhead bulb buzzed as he warmed a microwavable dinner, but he hardly noticed. The letters seemed to pulse with mystery, urging him to act. Taking a bite of overcooked pasta, he tried to calm himself by listing all the reasons this had to be a joke. Yet in the recesses of his mind, there was an insistence that such warnings, even if somehow playful, could hold a kernel of truth. His mother used to talk about the city's rumored secrets, ancient tunnels winding underneath, built atop older structures. She'd told him of ghost stories and half-forgotten legends that city planners had tried to bury under asphalt and progress. Many dismissed such tales, but the older generation sometimes hinted at unexplainable occurrences in the city's history. Desperate to put his mind at ease, Miles retrieved his laptop and did a quick online search for any mention of Laurent or Lauren Finch. The results yielded little more than genealogical records and scattered references that felt unrelated. Searching postal prophecies, supernatural letters, and a few phrases from the warnings led to random conspiracy forums or local urban legends blogs. He clicked through them, brows furrowed, scanning for anything that might match the cryptic instructions. One mention caused him to pause. A blog post about the painted bell, an old fixture from a 19th century church near the city's edge. Rumour had it that on a winter's night decades ago, the bell had tolled 3 times past midnight without any person or automated system to set it swinging. Some claimed it was a sign the city was under a dark star's influence, but no official explanation was ever found. Miles closed his laptop, unsettled yet strangely fascinated. Morning dawned with ominous skies. Dark grey clouds roiled overhead, and the wind hissed through the streets. The forecasters on the radio warned of severe storms with possible tornadoes, highly unusual for this region. Miles felt a prickle along the back of his neck. He tempered his nerves by diving into his routine, sorting mail in the quiet stillness of the station. Recorded thunder boomed outside while the lights flickered. Sighing, he pushed his cart onto the sidewalk, the wind tugging at his uniform jacket. Amid the swirl of mail, he noticed yet another eerily familiar envelope in his bin. No return address, addressed to an Amelia Keene. The street location was vaguely familiar, albeit spelled out in archaic script. A memory surfaced of an old fortune-telling shop that used to stand on Marsh Avenue, its sign reading Madam Keene's Parlour. He recalled that the letters mentioned a fortune-teller on Marsh Avenue. Could it be the same person? Determined to quell his growing anxiety, Miles decided to deliver this envelope personally. After finishing the midday portion of his route, he steered his cart down Marsh Avenue. The street was quieter than normal, the wind ripping newspapers from trash cans. Thunder growled overhead like a giant stirring in its sleep. He halted in front of a quaint single-story building with faded purple paint. A tarnished sign above the door read Keene's Consultancy Palm Readings and Tarot. It looked shut down, but a faint light glowed from inside. Gathering his courage, Miles knocked twice, and the door swung open with a low creak. An older woman, slender and dressed in a flowing shawl, stood on the other side. Her white hair was styled into a braided crown. Her eyes shut. She exhaled as if she'd been expecting him. No words passed between them at first. Miles handed over the envelope, and she examined the archaic address with a strange sort of resignation. "Come in out of the storm," she said quietly, leading him into an incense-scented parlour draped in thick rugs. Crystal baubles sparkled in the lamp's glow. Before he had a chance to introduce himself, the woman spoke again. "You've read them, haven't you? The letters foretelling the city's danger?" She said it as a statement, not a question. Miles stiffened, throat suddenly tight. I've seen a few," he admitted. "They warn about some kind of supernatural threat." "I don't know if I believe it, but faith is a funny thing," she replied. "But you should trust your instincts when they're screaming, child. This land has old wounds. Some nights, if the conditions are just right, those wounds bleed through." She set the new letter on a side table. "I might have expected them to arrive sooner," she said, almost to herself. Then her penetrating gaze returned to Miles. "We have little time. If the painted bell tolls thrice tonight, it will signal a weakening of the barrier that keeps him out." Miles blinked, heart pounding as though he'd stepped into another reality. "Who is he?" he asked, mouth dry. Her voice turned grave. "A thing older than the city. Not a spirit, not a demon in the conventional sense, but a being from beyond, hungry for whatever fear and chaos it can spark. It thrives in shadows and nightmares. People conquered it once, long before your ancestors laid bricks here, sealing it behind that barrier. But the city has become fearful wars, unrest, personal tragedies. When fear saturates the ground, it feeds him, coaxing the seal to crack. Despite the absurdity, Miles felt no compulsion to scoff. Instead, cold dread settled in his stomach. "What can we do?" he whispered. The woman motioned for him to sit at a small round table. She lifted a deck of tarot cards, well worn at the edges. "We must guard the painted bell," she said. "Ensure it does not ring thrice after midnight. There's a rope that's been removed, but other forces could make it move. The city's oldest wards are layered there. If it rings, you must intervene. If we fail, I fear the rest of the warnings will come to pass." That evening, Miles found himself in the swirling storm, heading toward the decrepit 19th century church. He had never trespassed before, but the thought of letting these warnings go unheeded gnawed at him. Madame Keen had given him a small talisman, a piece of rough quartz wrapped in copper wire, supposedly a focus for protective energies. He kept it clenched in his fist like a lifeline. Thick clouds blotted out the moon, and the wind roared, carrying stinging pellets of rain. By the time he reached the iron gates of Sayodets, the once grand doors of the church were chained shut, bearing a sign, "Condemned no entry." Lightning illuminated the spires, revealing once beautiful stained glass, now cracked and discolored. Miles circled around the back, pulling at rotted wooden boards that had been nailed over an old entrance. With resolve fueled by adrenaline, he squeezed through a gap into the musty darkness. Inside, broken pews lay scattered across warped floorboards, and the smell of decaying wood clung to the air. Overhead, the rafters creaked with every gust. Another flash of lightning revealed the shape of the bell tower staircase in the corner. He made his way past debris, mindful of each step. A clang of thunder shook the windows. With a deep breath, Miles ascended the rickety stairs, each wooden plank protesting under his weight. Upon reaching the top, he found the painted bell, named for the centuries-old murals that once ornamented its surface, now chipped and faded. Despite the shield of the tower walls, the wind snaked through cracks, rattling the ancient metal. He remembered the letter. "When the painted bell in the old church tower rings thrice after midnight, it shall herald his arrival." A battered rope stub hung from the bell's clapper, severed long ago. He remembered Madame Keen's words. Other forces could make it move. If fear permeated the space, it might ring on its own. Midnight approached swiftly, and the storm intensified. Rain pelted the roof in sheets, and Miles saw flashes of lightning overhead through a hole in the tower. He pressed himself against splintered beams, breathing shallowly, determined to keep watch. Minutes dragged, and the only sounds were the roar of wind and the pounding of rain. As the clock at City Hall struck midnight, he braced, ears straining for any sign of the bell's movement. The usual midnight toll from the city's official clock tower echoed distantly, but the painted bell remained silent. Relief pulsed through him, until a sudden hush fell outside, as if the storm were holding its breath. Then came a soft clang, barely audible. Miles' blood froze. The bell shuddered slightly, rocking on its pivot. He forced himself to move, wading through the jagged lumps of debris, to lay his hands on the bell and steady it. Another jolt, stronger this time, wrenched the bell's metal frame. It groaned, teetering on the brink of ringing fully. The gritty floor beneath him felt ice-cold, and a surge of dread gnawed at his insides. The air quivered, and he sensed something dark pressing against the walls of the tower, like monstrous hands reaching from an unseen realm. He gripped the talisman for dear life. "No," he muttered through clenched teeth, struggling to hold the bell in place. A swirl of wind battered the tower, sending shards of broken glass tumbling down, peppering the floor with fragments. Another seismic jolt rippled up from beneath, threatening to rip the bell from his grip, but he pressed with all his might. The first toll had been faint. He prayed that it did not count as a full strike. The metal rim inched forward, dangerously, scraping across the stone enclosure. Suddenly, a flash of lightning lit the interior with a stark white brilliance, revealing the outline of something like a swirling shadow or vortex forming near the bell. It made his eyes water to look at it, a swirling emptiness constantly shifting. Summoning every ounce of courage, Miles pressed Madame Keen's talisman to the bell's surface. A shrill hiss erupted in the air, as though dark matter recoiled from the object's energy. The swirling shadow jerked, unraveling into ribbons of night. A howling roar reverberated against the walls. Then, with a final crack of thunder, the presence seemed to dissipate as quickly as it came. The painted bell trembled, then stilled beneath Miles's trembling palms. Moments later, the wind rushed back into the tower, carrying the sound of rainfall. The hush vanished, replaced by the storm's ongoing fury. For several long minutes, Miles remained trembling in the shadows next to the unmoving bell, panting like he'd run a marathon. Slowly, the realization dawned on him. It hadn't rung thrice. In fact, the muffled clang might not have fully counted as a proper ring at all. As he gathered himself, he stared at the place where that swirling presence had manifested. The air seemed clear, though the tower's gloom was oppressive. Eventually, he found the nerve to descend the steps, ignoring the water that dripped through the ceiling. The church seemed quieter now, less ominous. Perhaps it was only an illusion, but he felt that some measure of danger had passed. Upon exiting, Miles discovered that the storm was already abating, though the sky remained dark and agitated. He hurried out of the condemned property and onto the street. Only faint streaks of lightning lit the horizon. Further down the road, he spotted a figure waiting under the halo of a flickering street lamp. He approached cautiously, but recognized Madame Keene's unmistakable silhouette. She inclined her head in a somber nod. "You have kept the bell from tolling tonight. I sense the barrier holding, though I fear it has been weakened. There is still much we must do to secure it." Miles nodded, exhaustion weighing on every bone. "But for now," she continued, "he has been thwarted. You bought us time." Relief fluttered through him, but also a grim sense of responsibility. The letters had pointed him here. He, an unassuming postal worker, had just prevented some malevolent force from seizing the city in one night. It didn't feel real, yet the ache in his arms and the residue of swirling darkness in his memory reminded him otherwise. Word travelled quietly of odd occurrences that night. A few people claimed to see flickers of purple lightning dancing in the sky. Others reported sudden nightmares at exactly midnight. A water main burst in the heart of downtown for no apparent reason. Most citizens woke the next morning none the wiser, chalking up the weirdness to the residual effects of a rough storm. But for Miles, there was no going back to blissful ignorance. Over the next few days, he found more letters. They emerged in the mail stream under various names, each hinting at a continuing danger. Yet these letters also contained instructions, rituals to strengthen wards, places of significance that needed blessing, lines of defense should the city's fear mount again. He and Madame Keene formed an unlikely alliance, using her knowledge of the city's old magic and his daily route that spanned every corner of it. Together, they distributed protective symbols, whispering coded advice to those receptive enough to believe. It was a hidden sort of war, waged in shadows against a threat most people never knew. While the city's bustle carried on, Miles carefully delivered not just ordinary bills and birthday cards, but also quietly placed small, protective talismans in mailboxes prone to surprise visits from whatever lurked beneath. If the recipients felt a subtle warmth or comfort upon claiming their mail, they likely dismissed it as a fluke. Yet those charms helped reinforce the slender boundary between this world and the next. As time went on, the letters became increasingly clear about a second wave of darkness. They predicted nights when the wind would shriek and flames of violet would flicker through the alleys. Each dangerous date approached with unyielding inevitability. Madame Keene's spells and incantations provided partial barriers. They might not stop every incursion, but they slowed the dark from extending its grip into the city. And through it all, Miles found himself entrusted with warnings and wards, forging an unspoken responsibility toward his neighbors. He never sought to become some arcane sentinel, but fate had thrust him into the role. He continued to wear his humble postal uniform, deliver letters, and maintain a semblance of normalcy. Beneath that everyday exterior, he carried knowledge that changed how he looked at every crack in the pavement, every old building, every shadow crossing the sidewalk after nightfall. Despite trepidation, he refused to surrender hope. The letters were not only warnings but also instructions. They spoke of the city's hidden resilience, of unmarked shrines and ancient blessings placed by the first dwellers. Each envelope, each cryptic message, was a small piece of an intricate puzzle. Miles discovered new corners of the city he never knew existed. Overgrown courtyards where iron gates shielded centuries-old sigils, rooftops inscribed with runes that harnessed fleeting moonlight, and cramped basements beneath shuttered shops where wards could be renewed. Whenever fear threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered his old routine, rising at dawn, sorting mail. It reminded him that life moved on, that things could be stable if enough people cared to protect them. Perhaps that was the city's greatest shield. On humid summer nights, after finishing late shifts, Miles would sometimes meet Madame Keene in her quiet parlour. She would brew spiced tea, the aroma mingling with the incense. Under the soft glow of her lamps and crystals, they pored over the next letter, deciphering arcane references. Outside those walls, neon signs and traffic lights flashed across empty streets. Sometimes Miles sensed ripples of an unseen presence just beyond the alley corners, waiting for a chance to pounce. But with each discovered letter, he felt a bit more prepared. In time, rumours and whispered stories started circulating among a small circle of city dwellers who believed. They claimed that unseen guardians watched over the streets, that a quiet man in a postal uniform and an enigmatic fortune teller kept malevolent forces at bay. Even as the city overcame new challenges, crime sprees, political tensions, raging storms, the deeper threat lingered in the background, always seeking cracks in the spiritual armour. But each new day also brought a new batch of mail, and with it a chance to deliver hope in the form of a stray talisman or subtle blessing. For Miles, the greatest miracle was simpler than any grand magic. The understanding that ordinary people could stand against ancient darkness if they combined faith, courage, and kindness. He still woke every morning to the same cramped apartment, still sipped the same bitter coffee, still headed to work beneath the grey dawn sky. But now, when he sorted envelopes, he felt he was sifting through more than just mail. He was guarding the city's future, letter by letter, fate by fate. While the threat remained, so did his resolve. In the unrelenting rhythm of life, overshadowed by looming supernatural forces, he found his purpose, an unassuming protector ensuring the city's heart kept beating in spite of ancient prophecies. And, day by day, that was enough.